Welcome to part 3 of this presentation. In part 2, we critically examine Cunningham's gradual construction of a fabricated evidential basis over a period of 35 years from 1835 to 1871 in order to establish Ceylon, India as the site of the Buddha's first sermon. In part 3, we now turn to the institutional and administrative mechanisms through which this broader colonial reconstruction of Buddhist history was advanced. Following the consolidation of British control in Ceylon after 1815, the colonial administration faced continuing resistance movements, political instability, and the challenge of governing newly acquired territories. The greatest obstacle facing British administration in Ceylon was the unprecedented strength of Ceylonese resistance. The British therefore sought to understand its underlying causes. They recognized that this resistance was often supported and at times organized by Buddhist monks. In response, the British authorities may have begun developing long-term strategies aimed at indirectly suppressing resistance while reorganizing administration and historical narratives in ways that would strengthen imperial control. We now turn to those strategies. Within the broader context of strengthening colonial control, the British government appointed the Colebrooke Commission in 1829, headed by William Colebrooke and Charles Cameron, to examine the administration of Ceylon and recommend reforms. Although presented as an effort to improve governance and modernize administration, the Commission also formed part of a wider colonial process aimed at restructuring society, institutions, and cultural authority under British oversight. It was within this expanding colonial framework that figures such as Alexander Cunningham later emerged, and where archaeological interpretation, historical reconstruction, and imperial administration became increasingly interconnected. In this section, we will examine how these institutional developments contributed to the production and legitimization of colonial historical narratives, including those connected to Buddhist sites and traditions extending from Ceylon to India. The investigation now moves from historical claims to the administrative structures that enable Cunningham to proceed with the mapping of Buddhist sites in India. After examining conditions in Ceylon, the Commission submitted its report and recommendations to the British government on 31st December 1831. The report was formally tabled before the British Parliament on 19th of June 1832. We now turn to examine the Commissioner's interpretation of Ceylon within its recommendations. The description of Ceylon in Colebrooke's report was factually erroneous. Ceylon occupies a place of profound spiritual and civilizational significance in ancient chronicles and traditions. These chronicles and oral traditions clearly indicate the island's role as a cradle of early human civilization and governance. However, in his report, Colebrooke described Ceylon as originally a Hindu province and further suggested that the institutions of the Sinhalese who professed the religion of Buddha were derived from Hindu origins. These statements raise important questions regarding the purpose and implications of colonial interpretations that later influenced understandings of Sri Lanka's Buddhist heritage. In many ways, this marked a turning point in the writing of Buddhist history. This brings us to a crucial stage in the process, the planning of the mapping. If earlier European accounts had located the origins of Buddhism in Ceylon, it is likely that the recommendations of the Colebrooke Commission contributed to a shift towards locating Buddhist sites in India. The key questions were which sites should be identified and who would be responsible for mapping them. The most likely candidate appears to have been Alexander Cunningham. We must therefore understand who Cunningham was at the time he began this task. At the age of 19, Cunningham left England to join the East India Company as a military engineer. At this stage, he was neither an archaeologist nor a recognized authority on Buddhist history. Nevertheless, This journey marked the beginning of the path that would later lead him to the identification and mapping of Buddhist sites, beginning with Sarnath. The rewriting of Buddhist history from Ceylon to India begins. One of the most important questions in the study of Buddhist history is this: who exactly was Cunningham in 1835 when he first identified Sarnath as a Buddhist site? Today, he is known as the father of Indian archaeology. But in 1835, that legacy did not exist. He was not an established archaeologist nor a recognized authority on ancient Buddhist sites. He was only 21 years old, a young military engineer at the very beginning of his career. Educated at Christ's Hospital and trained at the Addiscombe Military Seminary, he had been prepared not for archaeology, but for service in India under the East India Company. And that company, founded for trade, had by then become the powerful instrument of British imperial expansion. It is important to consider the influences that shaped Cunningham's early career. James Prinsep was his mentor until 1836, and as essay master at the Mints of Benares, worked only about 10 kilometers from Sarnath. It is highly likely that Cunningham learned about antiquities, inscriptions, and aspects of Buddhist history largely through Prinsep. Cunningham also later served as aide-de-camp to Lord Auckland from 1836 to 1840, which placed him within influential colonial networks. It is also highly likely that Cunningham's knowledge of Sarnath came largely through Prinsep. But in 1835, Cunningham's credentials were weak. He was a young military engineer, not an archaeologist. He had no formal archaeological training, no practical field experience, and appears to have possessed only limited knowledge of Buddhism and Buddhist history. These facts are critical. They cast serious doubt on the authority of Cunningham's early identification of Sarnath and suggest that it emerged not from firm historical evidence but from the manipulation of evidence within a wider colonial framework. This marked a turning point in the writing of Buddhist history. Cunningham's mapping of Buddhist sites signaled the beginning of a major shift, one guided not by clear evidence but by new interpretative and colonial priorities. As a result, Saranganath came to be presented as the place where the Buddha delivered his first sermon to the five ascetics. Unfortunately, this interpretation was gradually accepted and presented to the world, and many continue to believe that Sarnath in India is the authentic location of that event. The Sri Lankan locations will be discussed after the sites identified by Cunningham and Fiore have been examined in full. Before concluding this section, I would like to draw attention to further reading on this subject. A more detailed analysis of Cunningham's reconstruction of Buddhist history is presented in my book, Cunningham's Erroneous Accounts of Buddhist History, in which I examine how key Buddhist sites were misidentified, misinterpreted, and incorporated into a constructed colonial narrative. The book is available on Amazon and at selected bookshops in Sri Lanka. This concludes part 3 of the presentation. We have examined Cunningham's first major project, the erroneous identification of Sarnath as the place of the Buddha's first sermon, and the baseless nature of the evidence and assumptions upon which that claim was built. In addition, we have examined two highly significant aspects that have often gone unrecognized. Firstly, the possible reasons for the shifting of Buddhist sites from Ceylon to India, including the influence of the recommendations of the Colebrooke Commission. Secondly, we examine how a 21-year-old military engineer without archaeological training or a thorough understanding of Buddhism or Buddhist history was able to influence the relocation of the origins of Buddhist history from Ceylon to India. Having gained a clearer understanding of the reasons behind this shift, a clear manipulation, we now move to the next stage of the mapping process in part 4, the identification of Sankasa in 1842 as the second Buddhist site on the Indian map, presented as the place where the Buddha expounded Dhamma to his mother. We will examine the evidence used in that project, the limitations of that evidence, and how the wider process of identifying and mapping Buddhist sites continued under Cunningham.